welcome everybody. We've got a bunch of people online. We've got 22 people online. So everyone is clearly dressed up in their costumes, mostly off camera. I see Mitch is on camera. Hi, Mitch. And Lee's there too. Okay, well, I just want to start this by acknowledging Forever Green's funders, some of which are Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, Clean Water Amendment, McKnight Foundation, and Builders, among others. Reminding everybody that we are on video, that'll be uploaded online. If you have a problem with that, let me know and we'll blur you out. And we have, Mitch, since you are here, do you have any announcements to make?
Yeah, hey everybody. I had a minute with a baby sleeping on my chest, so I thought I would join, even though I'm mostly home wrangling a 4-year-old today. But I don't really have major Forever Green announcements, but I saw this come through this morning, this email about a new Sustainable Ag and Food Systems leadership position at RSDP. Looks pretty cool. So I just put that in the chat with the links for external and internal applicants. So if you're interested, if you know somebody who might be interested, please share.
Great, thanks, Mitch. Anybody else have any announcements before we get started?
We're dressed as Kernza.
Just, yeah, for people online, if you can't see. Cora and I have Kernza in our hair and brown and green clothes on, which equals Kernza.
Unfortunately, it's pretty backlit, so I see like little sticks above your head, basically.
Well, that's pretty much what they are.
That's what it
is. So we're late to you, Kernza. We're
So one of you is like pre-harvest Kernza and one of you is post-harvest Kernza?
Basically.
Nice.
Yeah, we planned that.
It looks good.
So we're ready to harvest you, Claire.
Well, great. Yeah, so today we're having Amy and Nick present on findings from research on the social sustainability of forever green crops with Kernza as a pilot case and its connection with forever green efforts.
Well, all right then, friends in the room and folks online. I am going to say a few preamble-ish things and to tee up Amy's presentation. And Amy and I both have titles for our presentations, which are different than the title that was you just saw, just to keep it lively. And so what I am going to talk about is a concept that is emerging as a useful way, we think, to think about a difficult and fundamental problem that we have in developing new crops. And that is that new crops are, by definition, as new crops are not ready for prime time in any sense. And yet, quite early in their existence, they have to be released out into the wild. And because it's essential to do that for a bunch of reasons. And so the sort of art of releasing them out into the wild in a way that causes good things to happen as opposed to bad things, I think we may or may not be aware of the many sort of disasters that have happened in the state of Minnesota around new crops after being released into the wild. The notorious case of Jerusalem artichokes is one example. There's another notorious case of trying to grow alfalfa for bioenergy. And these are, lead to long-lasting stories of bad things happening. Or hemp is arguably an example of a crop going out into the wild and not to good effect. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do with crops when they reach a point where they have to sort of get out there to start getting their legs under them, so to speak. So what I'm trying to highlight here is this challenge of how we accomplish what we could call early stage piloting of novel crops. And again, the basic issue is it's just so early. So the crop itself may or may not be well developed in terms of our ultimate vision for it. The markets for the crop are likely to be very modest. The availability of knowledge about how to grow the crop in diverse geographies in various diversified farming systems that might be relevant is likely to be lacking. Risk management tools, financing tools, all of the things that any legit crop has to have are all going to be very much absent. So what are you supposed to do in that situation where you have a crop that appears promising, but it's not ready for prime time in so many different ways? And so specifically, what is it that we have to accomplish if we release the crop out into the wild in some sense? So we have to, first of all, carry out R&D on the crop regarding how you grow it, how well does current germplasm perform, what in fact are its environmental outcomes over a range of geographies and situations, what do you need in the way of sort of post-harvest supply chain infrastructure and capacities. And we also have to start to build up what we can call support system for new crops, as I mentioned, that has elements of knowledge held about the crops, not just by researchers, but by the folks that actually have to grow it, obviously, and handle it and so on, market demand, et cetera, et cetera. And arguably, new crops just won't be taken seriously unless at least some rudimentary elements of this support system are available. So, you know, for example, experience has shown that it really is hard to get farmers interested in growing a crop for which there's no market. And so the existence of just some sort of rudimentary market is a really critical thing. So prototyping markets, you know, is a really important thing to do, as I'll get to in a second. I want to take a second to talk about this idea of a support system and to get us to think about what it is that we are actually putting out in the world as we advance crops. Because arguably what we need to put out in the world and build and improve is not just the crop. It's actually better understood as a system of supporting, mutually supporting elements that can be symbolized by the little graphic that you see there. And so in, you know, the jargon of innovation, this would be a socio-technical system consisting of the crop, but consisting also of a lot of different supporting elements, as we've been talking about, knowledge, markets, so on and so forth. And again, it's really critical to have some rudimentary socio-technical system out there, and you know, with markets being maybe the critical thing to begin with. So we need to be prototyping market channels, and this is why this whole 1% perennial initiative that was, I believe, the brainchild of the Land Institute, but which has been adopted by General Mills, is so interesting as you know, an example of, okay, here's an extremely rudimentary support system for Kernza. We've got, you know, we've somewhat advanced crop, and we have some folks that are willing to buy it with this interesting, very scalable marketing channel. So the broader question is, how do we equip new crops that are just emerging to cross the so-called valley of death, or actually, as we're getting more sophisticated in understanding the scaling of innovations in the modern world, the multiple valleys of death, the multiple periods of where resources are scarce, and yet a crop, in our case, a crop and its supporting system has to be de-risked to a point where it can attract additional levels of investment. And so that's the dynamic in this graphic that we're not really going to talk about. But the point is, what crosses valleys of death is arguably not the crop. It's the socio-technical system. It's the crop and its associated pillars of support. So the question is, how do we build these rudimentary, prototypical socio-technical systems that we've kind of got to have, according to this whole line of thinking, to advance new crops once they're ready to get out there into the wild. And the basic problem is that we have to organize cooperation across the multiple sectors that are involved in knowledge, demand, supply chain, finance, et cetera. And everybody has to be willing to do something costly, and that is invest in an inherently unprofitable thing. You know, the crop is not ready for prime time. It's not very easy to grow it profitably. And nor is it easy for folks that are downstream from production to make any profit from this. So this is all an exercise in cooperation in which a bunch of folks do costly things together. There would be no point in doing these costly things individually. That would just be, you know, wasted time and effort. But if what we have to do is induce a bunch of folks, the folks that have to be involved in this prototypic socio-technical system, to cooperate to do costly things in pursuit of a group goal. So this is a classic challenge in organizing cooperation. And so how can we think about organizing that cooperation? And there is a concept that has arisen in the sort of field of sustainability innovation around things like energy that has come to be known as the innovation niche, which we think is very promising for Forever Green. And what you're seeing over there on the left is a niche that was occupied by humans in antiquity in Australia. And it sort of illustrates the idea of a niche. It's a little sheltered, protected place. It's not exactly isolated from the world. It's sort of connected to the world, but it's kind of sheltered. It's not like a cave, you know. It's just a little hidey hole that that's kind of open to the world, but sort of protected as well. So I guess that's sort of a visual metaphor for an innovation niche. So what is an innovation niche? Basically, it is a network of folks that are piloting a new crop and its surrounding elements. Innovation niches are generally based in a place. They are understood to have a sort of a lifespan. In other words, they apply to the earliest phases of trying to develop new crops. So they're networks of folks that are doing the individually costly work of piloting the new crop and its supporting elements together. And the only reason it would make sense for them to do that is that they're motivated by some vision of a better world that's possible through this crop. And so they have expectations of what the crop would be able to achieve and deliver. Crucially, they're trying to learn. Everybody understands that the crop, the risk management, the markets, et cetera, they're all not really ready for prime time for one reason or another. But the point is to learn about them. And another crucial idea of this concept of an innovation niche is that that the cooperative relationships, say, across the supply chain, are really key to moving the crop forward beyond the earliest stages. And so developing better cooperative relationships is another key thing that is envisioned as occurring in these innovation niches. So in a research project that we don't have time to talk about, nor are we ready to talk about holistically, we're taking a look at 3 different cases that we think have characteristics of this idea of an innovation niche, which involve grassland agriculture piloting efforts in Wisconsin, that involve winter camelina piloting in various parts of Minnesota, and involve piloting Kernza in Minnesota, which is what we're going to focus on today. And we think this is an important knowledge gap in the context of agriculture. So innovation niches as a conceptual framework for advancing innovation needed to address sustainability challenges has not really been applied all that much in agriculture. So it's something that emerges from the world of renewable energy and other sustainability innovation domains, not so much agriculture. So we think there's an opportunity to, we think this idea should be better known among folks working for diversification and sustainability generally in agriculture. And we think there's an opportunity from the experience that Green and other parties have gathered in these cases to learn something about the, to use a very academic term, praxis of innovation niches. So praxis is a very important concept. It is the interplay between your theoretical understanding of what the heck you're trying to do and what you are learning in practice. That's what's meant by praxis. So it's a dynamic process. It's an idea that's sort of borrowed from the field of education, where it's understood it's really important for teachers to have an idea of what they're trying to teach and be constantly modifying that. So we need a praxis of innovation niches. So to shut up and segue to what Amy is up to here, one of the most important things about the sort of dynamics of an innovation niche is that the folks that are participating in it are motivated by their visions of a better world that the core innovation, the crop, could produce. And they are ideally, through their experiences in the niche, they are getting more excited rather than less excited about what the crop could do for the world. And they are also having their expectations sort of met. In other words, the crop is developing in the direction that they would hope it to be. So one important thing that you can ask about these efforts to develop and support innovation niches is, how do the participants actually feel? Are they, do they feel that they're, first of all, it's important to find out what their visions are, but also, do they feel that things are moving in the right direction as they, invest blood, sweat, and tears in prototyping the crop? So Amy's work addresses that. Another critical question is, what are they learning? What's the learning dynamic that's going on? So an important premise of an innovation niche is that, okay, you're trying this stuff out, it's costing you money, it's, you're likely to fail to one degree or another, but you got to learn from that. If you don't learn, then the whole thing is in vain. So that's another important question to ask is, what are folks learning? And otherwise, what are their experiences, sort of related to learning?
Okay, thank you, Nick, for that intro. And as Nick kind of introduced, I'm going to dig into, this real empirical side of the research, answering some of those questions about folks' experiences, highlighting Kernza. And quickly, I just want to say that there's, to thank some other collaborators on this who have been folks at TLI, as well as Tara Conway. And I also want to acknowledge Carmen Fernholz, who spent nearly a whole day piloting this interview instrument with me. And this work kind of builds on his idea of a perennial promise. And so many of the growers and value chain businesses working with Kernza so far do see it as this new type of tool that can move forward the ways they're trying to build a better world. Others are unsure if it's a fit. And also, so I just want to also thank them for their participation in this. And some of them only agreed to do these interviews with me because they trusted that their information would get back to Forever Green and to TLI to help inform this effort. So I'm happy to get to do a piece of that today. And also what I'll share focuses on the Kernza case. So it remains this open empirical question whether what we're learning will apply to other CLC crops. And also this research area is new and in progress, and I ask that you take away findings primarily as generative for learning and making new connections and for future work, kind of rather than firm conclusions. Okay. And so this is a quick overview of where the interviewees are based who are piloting Kernza. And I interviewed 63 growers and value chain actors from kind of all different roles throughout the value chain. And I just a note on time period is I completed this data collection in 2023. And there is still a lot of richness in this data set to kind of, keep working with that folks contributed to. And also Nick kind of introduced this Minnesota kind of Kernza piloting niche. And just to note that this data comes from both Kansas and Minnesota. The sample is about 70% actors from Minnesota. And on the topics I'm going to share about today, there's a lot of similarities between Minnesota and Kansas, and all the specific examples will be Minnesota based. So a quick map of what I'm going to talk through. So the focus of our seminar today is how social research with people learning to work with Kernza on the ground can matter in transition to CLC. And so this first part, this main part of the talk is going to focus on understanding these pilot actors' experiences in the innovation niche. So what have they been learning? And also what have they been giving that might be taxing? And then we'll have a little break for a discussion prompt. And then we'll have a shorter part two, depending on time, about recognizing their visions and expectations for the crop that they are developing and refining in the niche, and then some Q&A. So getting into part one, which is their experiences in the innovation niche. And the kind of first question I'm addressing in part one is what is emerging as socially beneficial and generative for them? And this is a focus on what they're learning and what kind of skill building is happening for them in the niche. And just to note is that not everyone is experiencing all these types of learning. And we also don't have evidence yet that they're kind of converting that learning into actions. But these are examples of what might be emerging. So first, this was one of the most common types of learning that folks in, not necessarily growers, but folks through the rest of the value chain were experiencing. And this was encouraging deeper thinking and forms of creativity in their craft. So a baker said, I'm always learning something every time I use Kernza, trying to make connections, thinking more, and having to think about why it turns out differently from last time, why it works this way, and comparing with how other grains work and learning more about those too. And then a brewer said, Kernza freed up a little part of my brain that's like, well, stop taking what's given to you. Maybe you can do more interesting things. I have to react when using Kernza, and that makes me better. And then a common type of learning occurring among growers is that Kernza is changing the field of practice of farming in some way and how they envision it. So growers are learning things like ways exist to be a profitable farm that are not what they're used to. That there are new concepts in agriculture and real forms of agriculture that disturb less, that it's possible to plant a perennial and still get a harvest the next year, that an alternative crop or a way to transition to organic does exist that could be possible for them, and that crops are beneficial for contributions other than yield, and that it's possible to grow lower yields if input costs are lower. So this is a little bit of a hint toward a mindset shift toward a viable system that might not be fully focused on highest yields. That's kind of people are thinking about as they work with Kernza. And then growers are also kind of realizing that they can feel excited about harvest more often in a diversified system instead of once with row crops. They're also problem solving by learning new practices and learning more about their machinery instead of buying a product to solve a problem. And they're also learning more about the mindsets of plants and the choices plants make. One of them described this as plant psychology, saying we're learning about how perennials and annuals think differently and how you consider that in management. And I also want to acknowledge that there were some alternative perspectives among growers too. Some said it's difficult having to think more about what we're doing. And others said they don't like that the crop isn't on their usual management advising app. They sort of can't do what they normally do. And also folks did mention how they think yields and seed size also have to increase. Another type of learning that's going on for both growers and value chain actors is seeing themselves as key actors in CLC transition, and they're building types of soft skills in the process. So they're getting to teach others and get asked questions about their farms. They're realizing that they are visible and a model, that Kernza is putting them on the map. They're getting better at forming their own path and not being curious, prescriptive, or perfect. they're gaining public speaking experience and finding their voice, and they're inserting themselves into more situations with openings. So this real sense that they're actors in this effort. Value chain actors also mention ways that they're learning more about their industry, about grain value chains overall, and about other parts of the supply chain. So a baker said, through working with Kernza, now we know more about the production of flour and what other local businesses are doing in flour, which is so helpful for our business, and said, what's a bakery without flour? It's also been a visible, concrete example to understand how value chains work and are built for people who maybe have not seen into that before. And also people that aren't growers are learning about different grain harvesting techniques and things like modifying combines. And then another type of learning has been about kind of social and economic alternatives for value chains. So growers have been learning or kind of building some skills in cooperative and collective marketing and business planning. Value chain actors have learned how to collaborate or source with a grower collaborative, which they haven't done before. And folks also talked about, they're learning how to make business decisions that might not only be about profit or, one example was, how do I convince that buying this more expensive product is not a negative. And then I just wanted to share a couple of quotes that I thought were kind of pretty interesting about kind of the learning that's happening for folks towards social change. And one of those is from a grower, and that grower said, I'm realizing I find organizations and relationship dynamics very interesting. Now I'm able to see inside an institution, like its pressure points where you can reach in and have some influence. And a private industry, kind of a value chain actor from private industry said, Kernza is a link to be able to observe and learn about grassroots structures, not being an organizer myself, and I'm able to do it without taking an active role yet. And then a grower said, even for someone who looks at it economically and in terms of maximizing efficiency, I appreciate that Kernza comes with other ways of thinking, unlike other grain, things other than the bottom line. So those are a few quotes that I think just kind of emphasize some really specific examples of types of learning towards social change that might be happening in a niche. And following that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the variation in this new learning and to consider it through an equity lens. So not everyone is learning so far. 10 of the 63 folks I interviewed did not report any new types of learning yet through Kernza. And there weren't really clear patterns in who those 10 were, but Minnesota conventional growers were the most represented in that group. So I think that's just, again, not a really clear pattern, but something we might want to track and think about going forward, why they might not be having the same learning experiences or maybe not reporting them too. And then for folks in this set of 10 who didn't report any new types of learning, I dug deeper into why they think they aren't learning. And one mentioned it's that they're not located near the other Kernza actors, and that might be getting in the way of making this whole project more substantive. They don't pay attention to Kernza or think about it a whole lot. It's just a kind of seed it and forget it kind of thing. Or it's a continuation of what they already do. So from a grower perspective, we already have experience adjusting to crops that are a little different. And from a value chain perspective, they're kind of in this space of learning about regenerative systems in general. And there's nothing specific about Kernza that they get out of it or that's influenced their thinking. And then some growers also brought up taxing aspects of the learning they have to do toward working with Kernza. So this grower said, by the time you learn a new thing about a new crop that requires few interactions and with only roughly 20 acres of it, you're done for the season and you have to remember the new knowledge for next year. And then another type of kind of equity and scale question I wanted to ask was, I also interviewed, this wasn't a large sample, but I did interview some folks who are staff at the large company partners who are working with Kernza, and I wanted to see if they're learning too. And there are some signals that they're experiencing some new types of innovative learning as well. They're understanding cropping systems' holistic sets of environmental benefits rather than only focusing on carbon mitigation, or one described that as kind of carbon tunnel vision that exists at their company. They're also noticing the crucial role of processing, and this will come up later as well. Seeing how that's tied to genetics, the cost of it, paying attention to who does that work and where, and equipment needs and changing equipment needs and just kind of how big of a role that is they hadn't seen before. And also thinking about, they're doing some thinking on social and economic alternatives as well. Not that they've necessarily implemented these yet, but they're learning about them. Things like how to pay more for grain, how to work with a low margin product, and how to build structures that can protect a crop with integrity. So that's kind of wraps that this section on the types of learning that are going on in the niche. And then I also want to shift to thinking about what people are giving to this effort and what might be taxing for them in the niche. That came up a little bit in the challenging aspects of the learning, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into this and specifically through the new types of time and new types of work that these actors are contributing to the Kernza effort. And so the question that I talked with all the interviewees about was whether they feel like they're giving their time to Kernza in new ways and taking on additional types of work. And they were pretty divided on this. 31 of them said yes, and 28 said no. And the preliminary patterns that I'm seeing in this is that all of the middle supply chain actors, so people in those processing and coordinating roles, said they're giving new time, and nearly all women, with one exception, reported devoting new time. But there's a similar mix across growers and end users as to whether they feel they're giving new types of time or not. And this is a whole set of types of new time and work that they're kind of contributing to this effort. So kind of hosting, speaking at, and attending events, bringing products to events, and spending off work time at them was one of the biggest ones. And regular meetings to plan and build out and fund new organizations was another large one. Just to note this kind of common grower take in the corner, that this type of work has been a notable new use of growers' time, and time that they saved or expect to save raising a perennial grain is actually kind of going into some of this organizational planning and business development instead. And so I'll just leave these up for just a second to have you soak in a little bit more about the types of work people are contributing. There's the testifying for the legislature and policy work, and a lot of relationship work. I mean, these might be familiar types of work for you all that you might be doing for Kernza too. And then for those 28 people who said they aren't giving time or don't see this time and work as anything additional, I wanted to think a little bit more with them about why that is. And some end users said they see this work as folded into and nothing beyond what they already do. Things like sourcing different flours and grains, working with various suppliers and small vendors, new trials with recipes and ingredients, and doing some of this adjusting. They see that as just part of their work. Some have not chosen to devote the time yet or made Kernza a priority. And then something that growers typically said, they don't have as much of an option to not devote so much time yet, but some of them describe themselves as not a joiner or as unlikely to ever go to events or conventions. So that's why they're able to be part of this, but opt out of some of that. And then they're also, and I thought this was particularly interesting and shows some sense for kind of interrelatedness across the value chain, or how, realizing that you need the other roles in the value chain for the value chain to work, is that they were also seeing other actors' contributions. So for example, growers and end users identified processors as a role absorbing the time and costs and taking some of the hassle and time out for them. And I thought this quote was just really helpful for seeing into how a value chain actor thinks about negotiating if and how and when they're going to contribute time to the overall Kernza effort. So they said, we do a lot of thinking about what's worth our time. Is it worth it to do these tasks financially or the best use of our time? Even if it's not, is it a positive thing for moving Kernza forward? We also know that some things that are a pain are less of a pain for us if we do them than if others do, like cleaning and milling, even if it's not the best use of our time. We do sometimes say no to helping, and we base the decision on whether we think an entity is trying to further Kernza for an impact or trying to catch in. Sometimes that's a gray area, but that's the breakdown of how we decide on using our time. I worry, but often look back positively on when we say yes to something for Kernza that seemed time daunting. And then we can kind of distill this into whether people think Kernza has been worth the time so far. And it was more common for folks to think so, that these time commitments are an expected part of involvement, a normal part of weighing how to spend their time, something they feel agency over, a worthy choice they opted into, or something they think will ultimately be worth it. And just as a small example, the grower said, I wanted to give free time to Kernza simply because it's interesting to me. And then other people don't think it's been worth it, that their time is worth more than what they receive from Kernza, that they just can't keep working without pay, or what they've been doing and giving so far isn't sustainable for them in some way. And an end user said, I've been asked to do things with my time that showed a misunderstanding of our business. I would have to give up revenue or cancel orders to do them. And then I just wanted to add this quote from an actor in the middle of the supply chain, thinking some of you might find this relatable. I thought Kernza would be under 25% of my time, but it's been 50%. And then one other topic I wanted to address in this area of new work and time contributions is something that I'm thinking about through an equity lens. And so a thing I noticed is that some end user actors in rural Minnesota from historically marginalized groups may be doing specific additional forms of cultural work in CLC transition. And they reported efforts to be Kernza voices, especially well informed, to be at events to absorb information, to have conversations, and to really practice talking about Kernza. And these two actors really talked about this role very similarly. So they said, talking about Kernza is good practice, so I'm ready to say stuff when I'm out there. Helps me in my role as Kernza ambassador. And the second actor said, I go to field days to take in information to be able to answer customers' tricky questions. I have a practice of being informed, having conversations about Kernza to be able to respond to customers if I'm putting a name on something. And then they also talked more in depth about these types of conversations they have. So the first actor said, I'm having uncomfortable conversations with people who do not look like me. That may help get to the basics of what we have in common. And then the other actor said, even if I'm having a tough time with my sales, I know I maybe had a conversation in a place where people don't look like me. And so this raises some questions like, how are these actors doing? Are they feeling burdened in these translational roles or any extra pressure to be informed good communicators about Kernza? Is this taking their time away from other things? Or are they able to work and act with Kernza, being fully themselves as this work that they are, actively taking on? So just wanted to kind of include that in this discussion of time use and contributions of work. And then to wrap this section, I just wanted to touch on a couple of other types of socially taxing experiences these pilot actors are having in the niche. One said, or this came up a few times, that they're getting interviewed more often than they might for other things. And there's exciting things about that. There's ways that they can, raise other issues they might want to raise when they have the platform that they get from being interviewed about Kernza. But they also really worry about that. They worry about things like, will I get the Kernza facts wrong, or will someone spin my story to an agenda? And there are also, this second bullet point was one of the most common things that they talked about kind of feeling really uncomfortable or hard for them in this kind of early Kernza adoption phase, was needing to bring down high expectations they have for themselves and their production and their processes. So for example, from growers, things like how their crop didn't pass testing and cleaning, or they're having this kind of first experience of a rejected product, that's been a challenge. And not just kind of for not being able to take that crop to market, but also for really kind of adjusting their standards for themselves. And then another unintended effect that working with Kernza and other CLC crops has had for some grower partners, and I thought this one was really interesting, is that working with perennials and winter annuals is increasing their anxiety about the vulnerability of their row crops, but at the same time, it's not yet feasible to do all CLC. So they're feeling a little bit more anxious about some of their existing crops than they did previously. So that's the end of that part on pilot actors' experiences in the innovation niche. And we had these ideas for some discussion. So I wanted to kind of just leave this pause for some of that to sink in, or if anyone wants to chime in on any of these prompts or have any questions, we could take a little break.
Do you want to say anything to introduce the first one, Amy? As opposed to letting it speak for itself?
Sure, yeah, I mean, this is new information and, an aspect of, some sort of empirical research to share on an aspect of crop adoption and scaling, and just wanted to kind of get an understanding of how kind of receiving or listening to this information might be landing with you all. So did you want to add anything, Nick?
No. Yeah, well said.
And it's interesting, and yeah, it makes me speak to a lot of it makes me think of a lot of conversations that we've had about like how do we attend to our early adopters or partners, like Carmen is a great example of one. Like, how do we tend to those really valuable partners that are taking on a tremendous amount of risk?
You could really, I mean, one of your prefaces is that early adoption is by people who feel very strongly about it and see like they believe it, right? You can see how these people are doing it because they believe in it, because it's so much extra work. There's no reason to do it otherwise.
Yeah.
But I wonder, from your sense, I mean, you also said we should be assessing where, not just where we want to go, but are we actually getting there? And what is your sense of that from the people?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, Stephen. So my view is that the expectation question, and the direction question, like, are we moving in the right direction from their point of view, is, it's partly about the crop, but I think it's more fundamentally about the whole socio-technical system.
Yeah.
So their marketing opportunities, the social relationships that are inherent in being a Kernza, being involved in Kernza, et cetera. And we will hear more about that in Amy's chapter 2.
Yeah, I think that is a good segue.
Yes, except I didn't necessarily mean to move.
Yeah.
Discussions.
We only had one thing on the chat. Pete LaFontaine expressed surprise that it was just when the person was saying that they thought it would take less than 25%, it was 50. He expressed surprise that it was just 50.
I might have missed this, but did they speak to did they feel like it was worth it? Like, I'm curious if they felt like it was equitable or worth it.
I mean, that particular example, like they did.
Yeah.
And they're in a role where they've had the capacity and the support to give that 50%. So in that case, yes. And I would say overall, back on that slide when I was talking about, whether they feel that this has been worthwhile or not.
Right.
I mean, it's more common that they do. But I also finished collecting this data in 2023. So that's another thing to keep in mind is like after 2 more years, I think it would be interesting to kind of follow up on some of this too.
Yeah, that's kind of my question, is how long the expectations are a long time in coming or being met? How long a redwood will in this innovation? Like when you really start to slump into that valley of death in terms of people's willingness to continue to put in what they see as become to see as inequitable effort for resources.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do think some of this is also helpful, especially the types of learning people are experiencing or other things that have been fulfilling about this is that, a quote I'm thinking of from one person was that, Kernza doesn't keep my lights on, but what sustains you financially is always shifting. And there's ways that she feels, like Kernza's filling her in other ways. And so I think there's some of this is also kind of evidence that while not even everybody that I interviewed here has even sold their Kernza yet. But there's other ways that being involved with this has been socially beneficial, and not to say that that's sustainable, but it's just sort of something to pay attention to.
I feel like that's a theme that I've heard from multiple people, is that in some ways Kernza, because of its early commercialization, possibly premature commercialization, it has served as a flagship of this vision of a different type of agriculture. So I think in a lot of ways that it sustains a lot of people that are involved from a values perspective. Is that it is a flagship that we can continue to kind of like, okay, there's progress happening and maybe slow.
The takeaway, and then I guess we should segue, but for me, a takeaway is that it's obvious that the people that Amy has talked to are putting a lot into this. You know, they are paying a price for their involvement with Kernza. It's also clear that quite a good number of them feel that price is worthwhile. But it's also clear that a decent slice of them don't, circa 2023. And so we, maybe have both a moral and a practical obligation as, folks sitting where we sit in the university trying to move Kernza out into the world to, be aware of their situations and, the care and feeding of the networks and people involved should be on our practical and ethical radar screen, I guess is a takeaway from.
Hey, thanks, Nick and Amy, for those really good presentations. I'm not even sure how you would design this, but did you get a sense of any sort of comparison in among farmers' feelings? Presumably, most of these folks are, commercial scale producers of commodity crops in their downtime when they're not doing Kernza. They feel a certain way about that. Is there any way to compare how they feel about Kernza to that, given the ups and downs of being a, for lack of a better word, normal farmer, as opposed to these sort of really groundbreaking, enterprising crops that you were looking at?
You should quote, it's what. Right.
Yeah, which quote were you looking at?
Well, Peter and Amy, I'm thinking of the one where the grower said, my experiences with Kernza only make me feel sort of more anxious about my experiences in my conventional operation. Because I get some insights or a different perspective on it, but it's not like I can transition to perennial agriculture at the moment. So there's at least that.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question, Peter. Yeah, I'm trying to think of other examples. Yeah, I mean, and that's not to say that everyone feels that their CLC crops or their Kernza crops are less, like there's different perspectives of risk within this set of growers. And so some do feel like the fact that, at least with CLC crops, they feel like their input costs are lower. And that's a way that they kind of can think about risk differently compared with just how expensive it is to get corn in the ground, for example. So that's kind of one way in which they're, comparing what goes into planting both. Yeah, and I'll get to a little bit, like one of the things that they see most, I was going to address this in a later slide, but one of the things that for growers, the way that they see Kernza and other perennials kind of best fitting into what they hope for their farm, is its potential to kind of save them time or help them manage their time, or particularly in like busy spring planting seasons that are becoming increasingly kind of variable in timing and rainfall and things like that. And so that's a hope that they have for Kernza, in comparison to their row cropping. But I think that's something that we would need to collect further evidence on to understand if they're really seeing those kind of time and kind of stress benefits from their perennials.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that. This is probably obvious, but I was thinking of, the diagram that Nick loves about how when systems fall apart, there are opportunities for change. The idea being that the ag system right now is kind of falling apart, and if farmers are seeing the opportunity rather than just being resigned to absorb the blows of the conventional agriculture system, those feel like two different postures, and I don't know how again how you'd assess them, but it seems like sort of an
Yeah.
important part of the transition theory.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it reminds me of another example, which was a grower who, is more conventional, if we could say that, and didn't find Kernza to be a very good fit, like trialed it and thought, maybe this isn't for me. And part of his thinking is that one of the directions he wants to take his farm into, kind of in response to how the status quo isn't really working, is to go deeper into kind of AI and precision agriculture and that type of pathway. And he doesn't really see Kernza and perennials as the best kind of fit for that model, kind of sees that as an awkward fit.
Maybe we should segue.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks again.
Yeah, we'll see what we have time for with this next piece. So this is looking more at the expectations and visions for Kernza that these actors are developing and refining. And so in this first section, I want to talk about, Nick mentioned this earlier on, that these niches are still situated in broader social contexts. They're not bubbles. And so this section focuses a bit on the kind of landscape level and community level factors that are kind of intersecting with their expectations for these crops and CLC agriculture generally. And so the first point I wanted to talk about here is land transition, that came up as a part of growers' future visions, for their farms and for CLC agriculture. And I pulled this quote from a Minnesota grower that I think is, states this really clearly. We would not be on the land at our size now experimenting with CLC crops if we had not received help from Land Stewardship Project to take over in a well thought out way. And if our land is nice and green in our generation and the next one plows it under and it turns into rows of corn, that kind of takes the forever out of it. And so what I wanted to do on this topic was collect some data on how Kernza growers are thinking about land transition for themselves. Kind of where are they on this topic, as sort of some groundwork for understanding how to think about this piece of the landscape. And so these were the most common plans that current Kernza growers had for their land after they're no longer farming. And the most common was that children take over and land stays in the family if they want to. And then another common one was that the very most important thing is that this land remains actively farmed and with a farmer, and also managed through sustainable practices or CLC practices. A good chunk of these growers said, I don't know, or I don't know yet. It's not set. Or they might not feel like they have enough land to viably transition it right now, or because Kernza growers are multi-generational, but skew a bit younger than the average farmer, at least within my interview sample. And I think generally some of them are still navigating their transition onto the land, that's kind of their primary focus right now. They can't really think about that later step. And then a few mentioned wanting to give their land to public conservation. And a few mentioned wanting to transition land to a farmer experiencing barriers to access or to a BIPOC-led or serving organization. So those are the array of ideas that Kernza growers have for this kind of planning. And then they also offered some suggestions for how to incorporate land transition into Forever Green's work. So they mentioned the idea of partnering with organizations who are kind of deep in this work, that maybe not bringing it fully in-house, that might not be the university's role, or to replicate this work that's kind of ongoing in these organizations that focus on this, but to make this a little bit more of an integral part of the expertise and the vision, and trying to lift up the models that do exist already in the Kernza or CLC networks around land transition. They also mentioned how can we tap into this increasing interest in land back or restorative justice among people with land in Minnesota. And we saw that in practice at a 2024 field day that Kurt Kimber hosted, and he kind of led and was supported in making that a topic as part of his Forever Green Field Day. They also mentioned thinking about land trust or conservation organizations as partners who might be willing to have some farmers work with CLC practices on that land trust land. And then some also suggested this idea, whether it's an existing tool that you collaborate with or a new type of tool, but thinking about how do we, how do we track who the landowners are who use CLC crops and practices and what they might be willing to do with their land? And also farmers without land access who might want to do CLC agriculture. So how can we kind of get a sense for mapping out who those people are and ways of connecting them? And then also CLC crops are shaped by a community level context that these actors and these niches are kind of developing within. And this piece draws on, when I was doing this research on social sustainability, one way from the literature that we can conceptualize and operationalize social sustainability is it's the intersection point of what people value and want to see maintained about their community and what they want to see change for the better in their community. So I took this approach to talking to Kernza adopters about how this community level context connects with their work with Kernza. And so these are what I learned from that. So the good things they want to see maintained about their community were really centered around the kind of social aspects of their business models or their value chain relationships that they really appreciate, whether that's help with physical tasks and friendship and people to shoot the shit with, or whether that's things like not feeling like I'm competing with neighbors for land or having suspicions. So these things that they really like about the relationships that they have where they live or in their value chains. And then another common good thing that they want to see maintained about their community is this idea that people can live on and make a living on small farms. And so this is one difference in Minnesota and Kansas. Minnesota, they called this 30 to 80 acres, and in Kansas, 500 to 1,000 acres was their idea of small. And this really came from growers, this point, wanting to really kind of preserve this comeback that they're seeing to an extent with small farms. That for now, they feel like their small farm can still provide a livable income. How can we maintain that? And keeping schools viable, and this idea that they wanted, that they're the fourth generation to take this bus route to school, and they want that to continue. So those were some of the maintenance aspects that came up. And then these were some of the pathways directions that they don't like, that they're observing in their communities and that they want to see change. And extreme land consolidation was the really big one here. And they also tied that to degradation of soil organic matter, that those two processes have been kind of happening in concert in recent decades. And that's something they hope to see change. They also mentioned kind of exclusion. And they also mentioned just not regular people living in farming communities and this kind of lack and loss of infrastructure like childcare and schools in those communities. And so they believe that CLC crops like Kernza can play roles in maintaining these aspects of their community that they care about and also changing what they identified as growing problems around them. So this is just an example of how thinking about crops in these contexts could be guidance for how to partner or what we might want to track as metrics over time that are things that are important to the early adopters. And then I want to skip ahead to, this is what I was bringing up earlier in response to some of the questions. So really thinking about the knowledge and agency of the people carrying out this transition on the ground and what are they learning about how Kernza fits into what they want for their farm. And so for growers, Kernza as a potential tool for time management and time and labor savings was the most common way that they see this potential. So one grower said from a labor perspective, it's our best crop that we plant. It gives me back time. And again, I think more data collection needs to be done on kind of if and how and when this is happening. I think we would need to build more evidence on this, but the idea that a crop gives you back time is like, I don't know what a better like selling point for something would be than getting time back. So that really liked that quote. And they also said it doesn't just save me time and energy, but it's about when it does, so those busy kind of tight spring planting windows. And then I also wanted to listen to what those potential time savings mean to them. So what could they do with that time that they're saving through a perennial crop? And they mentioned more personal and family time, more time for hobbies, the option to farm part-time, to hold their other jobs and volunteer positions. And to continue to farm as rural labor becomes harder to find was another point that came up. So if this is the most common way that growers are seeing Kernza as helping them move toward, the vision they want for their farm, that's something to think about. Like how could that guide us? And yeah, and as I said before, we might want to collect evidence on this point to see if these crops are really having these benefits. And then I want to do a quick touch on this point for value chain actors as well. And so for them in this Midwest context, because again, this is something that might look different for Kernza in the Mountain West or the West Coast or New York. But here, their kind of biggest interest in incorporating Kernza into their business was how it represents pride and value and quality in the Midwest. And, this chance to reflect on new directions for Midwest grain and to be part of that. And also to be able to source grain, that they're in a grain region, but sourcing grain locally is really hard. So that's one of the points that was really connecting with the small and mid-sized businesses that have started to work with Kernza. So that's another point to think about, like how could we tap into that? How could we support that? And so far I've shared some of this with some of the Kernza marketing projects as one way to, build on it. And then another thing that I'm seeking to do with this data was to really listen to growers' perspectives. So I was collecting their experiential new knowledge systematically on different types of topics. And I did this on topics that were central to agronomics and adoption, things like where did they place their Kernza plot and why, as well as some like stickier equitable scaling issues, like is Kernza a good or bad fit for beginning and emerging farmers? And so I don't have time to get into what I found on those today, but those are examples if you have applications for that kind of data or are interested in growers' perspectives on these things, like that's a place where I'm, very open and excited about connecting and, figuring out a process for how grower perspectives and knowledge can kind of intersect with, research and adoption and scaling work. And then to wrap up, these next two slides are just some kind of thinking examples on, how we can kind of observe and identify what some of the efforts that are important to the early adopters and how we can think about those intersecting with goals that are important to Forever Green and kind of an example for a process for that. And so this first example was in the brewing industry. One thing I observed in the interviews was that multiple Kernza users reported being in connection with the same BIPOC-led and survey movement organization. And that was unique in brewing, that didn't come up in any other industry. And so this movement group and their movement goal, one aspect of it is to support and highlight new beer recipes led by BIPOC and LGBTQ+ brewers. And I think one CLC goal or goal for Kernza is to develop more Kernza beer recipes. And so is there an intersection point in goals there? And not saying that this is something that they are interested in or something that should be pursued, but just an example of kind of ways to do this kind of observing, kind of recognizing the work that adopters are already involved with and how it might, kind of bridge with CLC goals. So that was an example from the brewing industry. And then I just wanted to give one example on the grower side, the production side with that point. So one thing I was observing when talking to growers is that they said Kernza can be farmed with older equipment, that Kernza growers are intergenerational and tend to have more than the average interest in learning practices rather than buying new things. And that agricultural machine and equipment repair knowledge is starting to be lost. And so they raised these potential places again for kind of intersections and efforts. Like one grower said, what if we had workshops for peer knowledge sharing, intergenerational knowledge sharing on machine and equipment repairs and adjustments? And for that grower, it would mean that knowledge doesn't disappear with him. And for Kernza adoption and scaling, it could help more Kernza farmers get started while avoiding some of those very high costs around equipment. or being able to kind of do these equipment repairs themselves. And then to wrap up, this is my last slide. I wanted to just give a couple of examples. This gets a bit back to the time use and what folks are contributing. But from a little bit of a different angle, these are examples of how small and mid-sized value chain actors express really wanting to volunteer knowledge and kind of see themselves as kind of helpful agents in this work to develop and scale Kernza. So bakers, for example, give a lot of attention to how they can highlight Kernza as an ingredient. Like one chose to make a really pretty bread type, thinking that that visual would attract people to Kernza and start conversations. One put Kernza in whole grain form on top of a baked good purposefully so that it would be visible and be shown off and noticed. In the retail and cooperative grocery space, people are keeping not every grocery manager is willing to do this, but some, or maybe it in some ways doesn't make the most sense, but some have said, I'm willing to keep Kernza products on the shelf, even if they're not earning their place financially. Like that's my contribution to this. Seed businesses offered knowledge to professionalize seed supply, technical assistance, and their research plots as ways they'd be open to giving to the effort. And then in school food service, they mentioned how, oh, we could test an ingredient with a large kind of captive audience. We could try to get their feedback on it. And we're learning about how to inject this novel ingredient into recipes on this food service scale across a large staff, which is very different from, home baking or a small bakery. So yeah, just again, ways to think about the interest that people have in being part of this effort and the expertise that they might bring to that. So that's it.
Thanks, Amy. I love that you gave us discussion questions.
Mhm.
That's like, I almost feel like it'd be awesome to have every week. What do you think about it? I think everyone is vocal enough that maybe.
Like you said earlier, I'm really interested to see how this possibly has changed over the last 2 years, especially with, more developments in the market and more accessible seeds. So, are there any plans to try to do that, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think in some ways there's so much time and effort and sort of contributions that people gave to doing these really long interviews. And there's a lot of richness in this data. And so in part, I hope that there's sort of more legwork, like more we can do with what I already learned. But I also hope that, so my hope would be to do some more kind of processing and kind of discussion and learning from this data set before I go back out and like ask for people's time again or collect more data. But yeah, that would be, I think, a great thing.
We had a question from Mary who got broke up. How are Kernza cooperators being informed of the impacts related to social connection that you just described?
Mary, what do you mean by that? Will you unpack that question a little more?
Maybe some more got cut off.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So what you just described toward the end, Amy, as you were talking about that, it seems to me it's a form of growing food, producing food that is, in some ways reflects forms of agriculture from decades ago, right? Where people are, they're much more reliant on each other for information and to some extent even resources and labor. And if you talk to many, sort of conventional corn and soybean growers now, I don't think you would describe them in that way. They're relying on their agronomists or crop consultants for information. They look for whoever it is that they can hire to bring in during times of heavy workloads. And oftentimes, I mean, there's still that social connection part, but it may not always be as strong in terms of sharing information and experiences as it has in the past. So what you're describing to me sounds like, really nurturing that kind of a social connection around agriculture. And I have the impression that that's important to the Kernza cooperators that you have spoken to. So in effect, that's an important, outcome benefit. And I suspect that they would be somewhat encouraged to be able to step back from their own personal experiences and see that see that collective connection that is happening. And maybe that happens to some extent during some of the symposia or like annual meetings that take place. But I wonder if there's another way to describe that in even maybe more specific terms that would be encouraging and enriching to the cooperators.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Thank you for expanding on that. That's really helpful. And your suggestion on thinking about how to make more sense of that and perhaps like share that back with growers is a really good point and something that I will think about. And I think another like related topic is, again, because these are early adopters, although many of them do conventional corn and soy or wheat otherwise, is what I'm observing an effect of who's in the early adopter group, or is there something about starting to work with Kernza that's creating some of these connections and social relationships as well? So I think that's something to continue to track over time. Whether it's a characteristic of the people who are joining or whether it's something they're really like learning and that's changing by being a part of it. But one thing I can say is that like nearly everyone, and particularly all of the growers, have met a new person through working with Kernza. And so I think there is something there. But yeah, thank you for your question. Great.
So I'd like to comment a little bit on that too, Mary and everybody else. In the Clover Belt case, the central Wisconsin place where we're trying to develop an innovation niche around grassland agriculture, there has been, under the auspice of this so-called Grassland 2.0 project, which is a USDA CAP project that's a sibling to the Kernza CAP, there has been an effort to institutionalize what goes on in the niche. In other words, to develop a set of folks that are working together, around a common sort of set of goals, articulated goals, an articulated sense of this is a common project that's happened. We call these learning hubs. And this is not true of the current situation, to my understanding of it, nor of the Southeast Minnesota work around Camelina. And the existence of some kind of institution that would allow the folks involved in an innovation niche to get together and better understand themselves as a group of people working towards a common goal and harvest the sort of social capital gains that I think are clearly possible that you're pointing to, Mary. That we're trying in our evaluation research to figure out how important those kinds of institution forming efforts are to making an innovation niche work well. The final thing I wanted to say is that to me, the big picture takeaway from what Amy has been presenting is that innovation niches are lively little spots. So, there's clearly a ton of folks that are trying to work out not just growing the crop, but the other parts of the quote unquote socio-technical system for Kernza. It is clear that they are learning left and right. It is clear that a lot of relational stuff is happening. in which they are coming into new relationships with each other, stepping out into new social roles that are relational, attending meetings, organizing, speaking. And it's obvious that they have expectations of not just Kernza, but the larger, sort of system that Kernza would be at the heart of. And that they see some progress towards that expectation, but also some limitations and so on. And so this idea that innovation niches are dynamic, networks and social spaces, place-based, that where a lot of things that are of interest to us as crowd developers are really going on. I think that's really affirmed by what Amy has documented in her, work. And we are doing some, to the question of what about now? We are doing some evaluation research with people involved in these three niches, not nearly as extensive as what Amy did, but also informed by an interest in talking to people who play organizing roles in these niches to figure out what seems to work well. And that gets to this crucial matter of praxis. So that's where we're at.
Great. I think we have one more question in the chat from Pedro. Said the current group focused on Kernza. What learning or changes would you do for groups of other crops such as camelina, petitcress, so forth?
Well, Pedro, that's exactly what we're trying to find out in the evaluation research with these three cases, because the three cases address grassland agriculture and camelina and Kernza. So we are trying to learn from experience with those quite different crops. And so we don't know the answer to your very good question, but we hope we're finding out in a bunch of interviews and group reflective conversations and so on that are going on in these three different niches.